The loudspeaker echoed through the busy terminal of the international airport. Flight 5Z307 to San Francisco is now boarding. Passengers, please have your tickets and identification ready. An elderly woman, small in stature and slightly hunched, slowly made her way toward the boarding gate. Her silver hair was neatly tied into a bun, and though her face was gentle, her eyes held the sharpness of someone who had seen a lot in life. She wore a simple beige coat and carried a faded canvas bag, its edges frayed from time. No one paid much attention to her, just another old woman among the crowd. The gate agent barely glanced at the name on her boarding pass, Eleanor G., before giving her a polite nod. She stepped onto the plane and looked around as if trying to spot something familiar. Seat 17A, window seat, over the wing. She placed her bag on the seat and carefully attempted to lift her small suitcase into the overhead bin. But her hands trembled and the motion was slow. The suitcase slipped. A young flight attendant rushed over just in time to catch it. "You really should ask for help, ma'am. This can be dangerous," the attendant said, not harshly, but without warmth. The old woman offered a soft smile. "Thank you, dear. I still thought I could do it myself." The flight attendant, Rachel, forced a brief smile as she hoisted the suitcase into the bin. Without another word, she turned and walked off, muttering under her breath just loudly enough for the woman seated behind to hear, "Always the elderly passengers, so much trouble." The old woman said nothing, settling quietly into her seat. Her eyes turned toward the small oval window, watching the tarmac bustle below. Moments later, a young woman arrived. She was black, graceful, with radiant brown skin and intelligent eyes. Her hair was tied in a neat bun, and she wore a chic cream-colored dress under a light beige jacket. "Excuse me, I believe I'm in the middle seat," she said kindly. "Oh, of course." The elderly woman shifted to let her in and smiled. "Long flight, isn't it?" The young woman nodded. "Yeah, hopefully a smooth one." Soon after, Rachel returned with a tray of drinks, starting her service down the aisle. When she reached row 17, the elderly woman raised her hand politely. "Excuse me, may I have a cup of warm water? I have a bit of a sore throat and the cold." Rachel sighed under her breath. "We're currently serving cold drinks, ma'am. I'll have to check for warm water later." "That's fine. I can wait," the old woman said gently. Rachel moved on, clearly annoyed. At the galley, she whispered to her colleague, "There's always one. It's like they think they're on a train from the 50s or something." What Rachel didn't notice was that the young black woman in seat 17B had heard every word. She looked over at the old lady again, who simply sat there with a peaceful smile, as if she hadn't heard anything. A few minutes later, Rachel returned with the warm water. She placed it on the tray table without a word of kindness or acknowledgement. The elderly woman nodded again. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. Rachel walked away. The engines hummed as the plane began to taxi. The elderly woman leaned her head against the seat, eyes closed. The young woman beside her put in her headphones and quietly settled into her own world. Everything seemed calm, but no one knew the truth about the quiet old woman in seat 17A. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the founder of the airline operating that very flight. The plane soared steadily through the clouds, carrying its passengers toward their destination. Each person lost in their own thoughts, unaware that one quiet woman seated by the window held a secret that could shift the tone of the entire flight. Rachel, the flight attendant, didn't give the elderly woman in seat 17A another glance after handing her the warm water. She returned to the galley with an eye roll and a muttered complaint. "Pretty sure she's never flown before. Asking for warm water, acting like she's on a cruise," she whispered to her fellow attendant, Anna. Anna chuckled. "Honestly, like she's someone's sweet old grandma who thinks the flight is her living room." They both laughed, completely unaware that the woman they were talking about could hear every word. She didn't react. Instead, she sat quietly, her gaze fixed outside the window, the clouds drifting below as if carrying memories from a lifetime ago. A few minutes passed before Rachel returned to check on the passengers in row 17. She stopped at seat 70A, looking down with a neutral, almost cold expression. "Do you need anything else, ma'am?" she asked flatly. The elderly woman offered her a soft smile. "No, thank you, dear. That will be all." Rachel gave no reply, simply turned to leave. But just as she took a step away, a voice stopped her. "Could you not do that?" It was the young black woman seated next to the elderly lady. Her voice wasn't loud, but firm, unapologetically calm. Rachel blinked. "Excuse me?" The young woman looked up, eyes unwavering. "That tone, that attitude, just stop. We're all human. The way you treat someone says more about you than about them." Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She gave a quick nod, forced a tight smile, and turned back to the galley, this time without a snide comment. The elderly woman glanced sideways at her seatmate. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were exchanged, but gratitude lingered in that smile. Moments later, the old woman slowly reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out a small wallet. From it, she carefully unfolded a weathered letter, creased at the corners and faded with time. She read it in silence, her eyes tracing the lines like they were etched into her heart. It was a letter from years ago. The handwriting was youthful and clean, filled with raw emotion and longing. A message from a daughter to a mother. "Mom, if you ever read this, I hope you can forgive me for not being there when Dad passed. I know you were angry, and I know I failed you both. But no matter what, I love you. I miss you. I never stopped." Her eyes lingered on the words, and for a moment they glistened with memory. Pain, regret, and something softer. Perhaps reconciliation. She folded the letter gently and returned it to her bag, then turned back toward the window. Her seatmate noticed but didn't intrude. Instead, she simply offered the silence as a kind of comfort. As the plane continued its journey, passengers relaxed. The atmosphere felt lighter, until a sudden chime sounded through the cabin. The voice of the captain came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have a very special guest on board. Please join us in welcoming Eleanor Grace, founder of this very airline, seated in 17A. Gasps and whispers spread like a ripple through the cabin. Rachel froze mid-step in the aisle. Her eyes widened, breath caught in her throat. The old woman in 17A didn't move. She just smiled gently, her gaze still set out the window. But now, every pair of eyes turned toward her. Passengers whispered her name. Some glanced down the aisle toward her with awe. Others looked shocked they hadn't realized who she was. The young black woman beside her looked at the old lady and smiled knowingly. "I had a feeling there was more to you," she said softly. Still, the old woman said nothing. She didn't need to. Back in the galley, Rachel stood frozen, her cheeks flushing with heat. Slowly, she turned to look down the aisle at the woman she had dismissed just minutes ago. But this time, her eyes were filled not with irritation, but with disbelief, shame, and something that felt a lot like fear. Rachel stood still in the galley, her heart pounding in her chest. Eleanor Grace. The name echoed in her mind like a drum. It wasn't just a name, it was the name, emblazoned on every wall plaque at headquarters, printed on every employee training manual, mentioned with reverence in every corporate meeting she'd ever attended. The founder, the legend, the woman who built the airline from the ground up, and she had been treating her like a burden. Rachel's mouth went dry. Her mind raced through every word she'd said, every eye roll, every complaint, every sigh of frustration, every moment when she had chosen impatience over kindness. "Oh God," she whispered to herself. Her co-worker Anna, who had just returned from the back, whispered, "Wait, that's Eleanor Grace?" Rachel nodded slowly. Anna's face paled. "Do you think she noticed us talking about her?" Rachel didn't answer. She didn't have to. Meanwhile, back in seat 17A, Eleanor Grace remained calm. Her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. She wasn't gloating. She didn't look like someone who wanted to punish or embarrass anyone. In fact, she hadn't said a single word since the announcement. The young woman beside her, sensing the shift in the cabin's energy, leaned slightly closer. "People are whispering your name," she said softly. Eleanor chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Let them. I've had enough birthdays for that to stop surprising me." "I had no idea who you were," the young woman admitted. "Good," Eleanor replied. "I like flying unnoticed. You learn a lot when people think you're just another passenger." Her eyes shifted subtly toward the front of the plane, toward the galley where Rachel stood hidden from sight. "You see who people really are," she added. The young woman followed her gaze. "Do you often do this?" "Occasionally," Eleanor said. "It reminds me what kind of company we're really building, not from the boardroom, but from seat 17A." Back in the galley, Rachel was spiraling. What would happen when they landed? Would she be fired on the spot? Reported? Would her name end up in a formal complaint? Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to refill the coffee carafe. But then she stopped. A thought crept in, quiet and painful. What if she really had hurt that woman's feelings? Not as a company founder, but just as a human being? She took a deep breath, smoothed her uniform, and stepped out from behind the curtain. As she walked down the aisle, whispers faded. Passengers watched her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. But Rachel didn't stop until she stood beside seat 17A. Eleanor turned her head to look up at her, calm as ever. Rachel lowered herself slightly so they were eye level. She swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I want to apologize," she said. "Not because of who you are, but because of how I acted." The cabin was quiet. People leaned closer, trying to hear. "I was rude," Rachel continued. "Impatient, dismissive. That's not who I want to be, and it's not who our airline is supposed to be. I'm sorry." Eleanor studied her face. Rachel held her gaze, not blinking, not flinching. After a long pause, Eleanor finally spoke. "I accept your apology," she said gently. Rachel let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." "But let me ask you something," Eleanor added. "If I hadn't been me, if I were just another elderly woman flying alone, would you still apologize?" Rachel hesitated. "I'd like to think I would, but honestly, maybe not." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then this flight has taught us both something." Rachel straightened up, blinking back emotion. "It has. More than you know." As she walked away, she heard a few passengers quietly clap. It wasn't loud, just a soft ripple of recognition, an acknowledgement of humility, of growth. Rachel returned to the galley, her face flushed but lighter than before. Anna raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Rachel smiled faintly. "I just met the woman behind the logo." In 17A, Eleanor closed her eyes and rested her head back. For her, the apology wasn't about status. It wasn't about power. It was about watching the values she had built her company on take root, even in difficult moments. And beside her, the young black woman whispered, "That took guts, for both of you." Eleanor smiled, eyes still closed. The sky's a good place for reflection. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet. The buzz of quiet conversation, the hum of engines, and the occasional clink of cutlery blended into a soft white noise. But at seat 17A, something deeper stirred beneath the calm. Eleanor Grace sat still, eyes closed, a calm presence in a world often moving too fast. Beside her, the young woman, whose name Eleanor had yet to ask, glanced over, curious. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said softly, "but why fly commercial if you built the airline?" Eleanor opened her eyes, a small smile forming. "That's a fair question." She turned her head slightly, facing her seatmate for the first time since the announcement. "I could fly private, easily. I have. But there's something honest about being here, in the middle of it all. Among the people who keep this company alive. Not just the crew, but the passengers too." The young woman nodded slowly. "You're like an undercover boss," Eleanor chuckled. "Something like that. But I'm not here to catch anyone doing wrong. I'm here to see if the heart of the company is still beating the way it should." There was a pause. Then the young woman extended her hand. "I'm Maya." Eleanor shook it gently. "Eleanor, but I think you figured that out." Maya smiled. "I did. I'm glad I did. You remind me of my grandmother. Sharp, kind, doesn't say much unless it matters." "I'll take that as a compliment," Eleanor said warmly. Maya turned thoughtful. "Can I ask another question?" "Of course. Was it hard? Building an airline, I mean. Especially being who you are?" Eleanor looked out the window. Her reflection stared back at her, soft but weathered, like a woman who had walked through storms and still smiled at the rain. "It was exhausting," she said simply. "Men didn't take me seriously. Investors doubted me. I got called names, too emotional, too fragile, too old-fashioned, but I knew something they didn't." "What was that?" Maya asked. "That people don't remember airlines. They remember how they were treated. And I knew, if I could build a culture where kindness came before profit, the company would outlive me." Maya leaned back, letting that sink in. "And has it?" she asked. Eleanor gave a small sigh. "In some ways, yes. In others, I'm still watching." Maya nodded slowly. "That flight attendant, Rachel. She messed up, sure, but she owned it. That means something, right?" "It does," Eleanor agreed. growth matters, and courage comes in many forms. They sat in silence for a moment, then Eleanor added, "But it's also a reminder. We hire people to represent us, not just in uniforms, but in values, and when those values slip, the whole foundation cracks." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, intrigued. "So what happens now? Will she get in trouble?" Eleanor paused. "I haven't decided yet," she said honestly. "Sometimes a conversation does more than a reprimand. Sometimes silence says what a memo can't." Maya smiled. "You're wise." "I've made enough mistakes to be," Eleanor replied. A moment later, the seatbelt sign flickered on. The captain announced turbulence ahead. As the plane dipped slightly, Maya instinctively reached for the armrest. Eleanor noticed and gently placed her hand over Maya's. "First time flying?" she asked. "No," Maya said with a nervous laugh. "Just still hate the feeling." "Airplanes, like people, wobble sometimes," Eleanor said. "Doesn't mean they'll fall." The plane steadied again. Over the intercom, the captain announced a clear descent path and thanked passengers for their calm. The lights brightened slightly. Maya looked around, then leaned in a little. "You know, when I first boarded, I saw you struggling with your bag, and I judged you. I thought you were just another fussy old lady." Eleanor smiled, eyes twinkling. "That's fair. I look like a fussy old lady. But now, I see someone who built something real," Maya said. "And I'm glad I sat next to you." "I'm glad too," Eleanor replied. "You reminded me why I started this airline in the first place." In the galley, Rachel stood watching them from a distance, unsure whether to approach again. She had seen the two women talking for a while, laughing even. She swallowed her pride and made a decision. Carrying a small paper napkin folded neatly around a cup of tea, she walked quietly back to seat 17A. "Miss Grace," she said gently, "I thought you might like some chamomile for the landing." Eleanor looked at the cup, then at Rachel. No judgment in her eyes, just something deeper, an invitation to do better. "Thank you, Rachel. That was thoughtful." Rachel nodded. "I'll be at the gate if you need anything after we land." And then she turned, not rushing, not fleeing, but with just a little more grace than before. The final descent began with a familiar mechanical whir as the plane adjusted its flaps. Seatbelt signs blinked back to life, and the captain's voice floated over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've started our descent into San Francisco. Please ensure your seatbacks and tray tables are upright and locked. Thank you for flying with us today." Eleanor Grace gently folded her hands in her lap. The clouds outside had begun to thin, revealing the golden city below bathed in the last light of afternoon. Beside her, Maya removed her earbuds, wrapping the cord carefully, then looked over with a smile. "Well, this has been the most eventful flight I've ever had." Eleanor returned the smile. "I can't promise all my flights are this dramatic." Maya chuckled. "You said you used to do this often, flying in secret. Ever been recognized mid-flight like today?" "Only twice," Eleanor said with a hint of mischief in her voice. "Once by a pilot who'd been with the company since day one. He cried when he saw me, said I reminded him why he started flying." Maya raised her brows. "And the second? By a little boy. Couldn't have been older than 7. He came up to me at the gate and asked if I was the airplane lady." Maya grinned wide. "That's adorable." "It was," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes kids recognize truth before adults do." As the plane drew closer to the runway, Rachel stood at the front of the cabin, making her final round of checks. Her hands moved automatically, seatbelts fastened, bags stowed, tray tables locked, but her thoughts remained firmly on 17A. Every step she took closer to the back of the cabin felt heavier, like walking against gravity. As she reached Eleanor's row, their eyes met again. No longer tense, no longer full of uncertainty. But something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of change. Rachel gave a small nod, not as a flight attendant to a passenger, but as a student to a teacher. And Eleanor nodded back, eyes calm, as if to say, "Lesson received." The landing gear lowered with a rumble. The plane dipped slightly, then glided toward the earth. A moment later, rubber kissed runway, and the aircraft bounced once, then steadied with a roar as reverse thrusters slowed its momentum. Passengers clapped. A few cheered. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, Maya turned toward Eleanor. "I'm gonna look you up," she said playfully. "You know that, right? There's no way I'm not Googling Eleanor Grace Airline the second I get off this plane." Eleanor laughed. Just remember, the internet always makes people taller and more dramatic than they really are. I don't think it could make you any more impressive than you already are, Maya said sincerely. For a second, Eleanor didn't answer. Her expression softened, like someone absorbing words she hadn't heard in a long time. Thank you, she said simply. The plane finally came to a full stop at the gate. Seatbelt signs flicked off. People scrambled to unbuckle, stretch, check phones, and retrieve bags. But Eleanor didn't rush. She remained seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. Rachel reappeared at her side. This time there was no formal tone, no obligation, only honesty. "Miss Grace," she said, "I know you accepted my apology earlier, but I also wanted to thank you." Eleanor looked up, intrigued. "For what?" "For giving me the chance to do better. Most people with your status would have called for a supervisor, filed a complaint, asked for my name to be written down." Eleanor smiled. "But what would that have taught you?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "I guess nothing as lasting as this did." Eleanor placed a hand gently on Rachel's arm. "That's the kind of leader I wanted to be, and it's the kind of crew member I hope you become." Rachel's eyes glistened for just a moment before she gave a small, grateful smile and stepped back to allow Eleanor and Maya to exit. As they walked down the jet bridge together, Maya turned to Eleanor. "I know you probably have a driver waiting or a private lounge or something very fancy," she teased. Eleanor chuckled. "Actually, I'm getting picked up by my granddaughter. She's late 99% of the time, so I figured I'd enjoy some fresh air while I wait." Maya paused at the terminal fork. "I guess this is where we part ways." "For now," Eleanor said. "Will I see you again?" Eleanor winked. "Only if you fly often and look around." They hugged, a real warm, grounding embrace between two strangers who had become something more in just a few hours. As Eleanor watched Maya disappear into the crowd, she pulled out her phone and opened a note she had kept for months, a draft of a speech she had never given. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment, then she began to type. "Leadership is not about being seen. It's about seeing others, especially when they believe no one is watching." She hit save, then walked out into the world, unnoticed again, just the way she liked it. Rachel stood at the gate, watching passengers filter out into the terminal, her posture more composed than earlier. But the weight of the day still hung on her shoulders. It wasn't just about getting called out. It was about being seen, in both the best and worst way. She'd been trained to smile through stress, to follow procedures, to maintain composure under pressure. But no one had ever trained her for this, to confront her own assumptions, her own impatience, her own blind spots. And certainly, no one had prepared her to be humbled by a passenger who turned out to be the owner of the airline. A hand touched her elbow. She turned. It was Anna, her fellow flight attendant. "You okay?" Anna asked softly. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." Anna gave her a meaningful look. "I heard what she said. Eleanor Grace. That was wild." Rachel looked away. It was more than wild. It was awakening. There was a silence between them for a moment, broken only by the shuffle of cleaning staff entering the cabin behind them. Anna hesitated, then said, "I don't know if I could have done what you did. Apologized like that, in front of everyone." Rachel offered a faint smile. "It wasn't for everyone. It was for me and for her." Anna looked down, her expression unreadable. Then she patted Rachel gently on the back. "Well, I think you handled it with more grace than most." Rachel gave a small laugh. "Pun intended?" Anna grinned. "Absolutely." Elsewhere in the terminal, Maya sat on a bench just outside baggage claim, her phone in hand. She had already looked up Eleanor Grace, and what she found had floored her. Photos of Eleanor from the 1980s, standing in front of the airline's very first plane. Magazine covers, quotes. A TED Talk from 10 years ago titled "Skyward, Building Empathy at 30,000 Feet." Everything about her screamed legacy. And yet, Maya had almost written her off as someone irrelevant. "I almost missed her entirely," Maya whispered to herself, "and I was sitting right next to her." She looked up, as if hoping to spot Eleanor again, but the woman had vanished as quietly as she'd arrived. At the curb outside the terminal, Eleanor stood in a patch of shade, a simple tote bag over her shoulder, sunglasses on, waiting. A compact car pulled up to the curb. Inside was a girl no older than 25, curly hair tied up in a messy bun, blasting upbeat music with the windows halfway down. The girl leaned over the passenger seat and called out, "Grammy!" Eleanor smiled and stepped forward. As she slid into the front seat, she shut the door gently, the noise of the terminal fading instantly. "Sorry I'm late," the girl said, already pulling back into traffic. Traffic was insane. "You're always late," Eleanor replied with a grin. "Yeah, but at least I'm consistently late." Eleanor laughed. They drove for a few minutes in silence before her granddaughter glanced over and said, "You look peaceful." "I am," Eleanor replied. "What happened on the flight?" Eleanor took a moment before answering. "Someone made a mistake, then they owned it. Then we talked." Her granddaughter nodded. "Still doing your mystery flyer thing, huh?" Eleanor winked. "Can't help it." The younger woman shook her head in admiration. "You're like the Batman of aviation." "I'm the grandma of aviation," Eleanor corrected, both of them laughing. That evening, Rachel sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a blank notepad. She'd poured herself a cup of tea, chamomile like the one she had offered Eleanor at landing. Something about it felt grounding now. She picked up her pen and began to write. "What I learned today," but she stopped. That wasn't how she wanted to start. She crossed it out and wrote instead, "What I didn't know I needed to learn." She paused, then continued writing, about empathy, presence, and how kindness isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's just taking the time. She wasn't sure what she would do with the letter, whether she'd mail it, submit it to HR, or just keep it to herself, but it felt necessary. Some truths needed to be written, even if only to be faced. And miles away, in a cozy apartment lined with shelves of old aviation books, Eleanor placed the same tote bag from the plane down on her chair. She pulled out the folded letter from her daughter, the one she always carried. She read it again, slowly. Then she reached for her phone and typed out a message to a number she hadn't dialed in a while. "Hi, I was thinking about you today. I'd like to talk. Love, Mom." She hit send. 3 days had passed since Flight 5Z307 touched down in San Francisco, but the effects of that journey lingered in ways no one could have predicted. For Rachel, the flight attendant, those 48 hours had been filled with reflection. She hadn't been disciplined or called into the office. There had been no official memo or warning from management, but somehow the silence from Eleanor Grace was louder than any reprimand. It made her think, and not just about that one flight, but about how she showed up every day. On her next shift, Rachel stood outside the jet bridge before boarding, her uniform pressed and pristine. She stared at the name on the manifest, Flight 118 to Denver, new day, new faces, but she wasn't the same woman who had worked Flight 307. "Ready?" Anna asked as she approached. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, and I'm trying something new today." Anna raised an eyebrow. "New lipstick? New perfume?" Rachel shook her head with a grin. "New mindset." She stepped onto the plane and began her pre-flight checks with renewed energy. She smiled more sincerely. She listened when passengers asked questions, and when an older man fumbled with his seatbelt, she didn't sigh. She knelt down and gently helped him. By the time the cabin doors closed, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just wearing the uniform, she was embodying it. Meanwhile, across town, Maya sat in her favorite cafe, laptop open, a blank document staring back at her. The previous night, she had scribbled pages of notes, quotes, and reflections from her conversation with Eleanor. But now, she stared at the screen, unsure how to begin. She wasn't a journalist. She wasn't writing a formal article. She just knew she needed to capture what that flight had meant. Not just because she'd sat next to a legend, but because the experience had cracked something open inside her. Maya had always been ambitious, a fast talker, quick thinker, rising fast in her field. But she realized she'd also been missing people in her rush to succeed. She'd been sitting next to opportunities for connection and letting them pass. The cursor blinked. Then she typed, "We sit beside strangers every day. On buses, on trains, on flights. Most of the time, we don't look up. We don't ask. We don't wonder. But once in a while, you find yourself next to someone who changes everything." That same morning, in a quiet, sunlit room, Eleanor Grace sat by her window with a cup of black coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. She scrolled through old messages, then stopped at one. Daughter. No photo, no recent conversations, just a name and silence. Her finger hovered, then tapped. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Voicemail. Eleanor hesitated, then left a message. Hi, honey, it's me. I know it's been a while and I know I haven't been easy to reach, but I'm ready to listen now. Really listen. If you're willing, I'd love to talk. Anytime. No pressure. She ended the call and stared at the phone. It didn't ring back. Not yet. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready. Back in the airline's corporate office, something else was happening. An email had been flagged for review. It came from a flight attendant, Rachel. Subject line, a letter I needed to write. Inside was a personal account of the experience on Flight 5Z307. It was raw, vulnerable, and honest. She didn't sugarcoat her behavior. Instead, she detailed what she had learned and what she now understood about what leadership and service meant. The email found its way to the desk of the VP of Crew Development, who read every word in silence. At the end of the letter, Rachel had written, "If we want this airline to reflect the vision of Eleanor Grace, we can't just train for efficiency. We need to teach empathy. I needed to learn it the hard way, but maybe others don't have to." 2 weeks later, a memo was sent to every base. Subject, Empathy in Action, New Initiative for Crew Culture. Inside, a message announcing a pilot program based on the principles of Eleanor Grace's founding values, incorporating real-life case studies, including a lesson from Flight 5Z307, anonymized but clear in its message. Rachel had no idea it was her story. No one told her. But when she read the memo in the break room, her chest tightened with recognition and quiet pride. As for Maya, her reflection turned into a short essay that she decided to post on her personal blog. She titled it, "The Woman in Seat 17A." Within hours, it was shared across social media. The story resonated not because it was about a famous CEO, but because it was about Grace shown quietly at 35,000 feet. By the end of the day, it had gone viral. And at the center of it all, a photo Maya had taken with permission. A soft, warm picture of her and Eleanor side by side, heads slightly tilted toward each other, smiling. The caption read, "Don't underestimate the quiet ones. They might be the ones who built the sky you're flying through." The article titled, "The Woman in Seat 17A," had already made its rounds through social media, reaching thousands of readers by the second morning after it was published. But by noon on day 3, it had made its way to places Maya never imagined it would. Her inbox was overflowing. Messages from flight attendants, customer service reps, even gate agents, all thanking her. Some shared their own stories, of silent strength, of passengers they'd misjudged, of moments they wished they could redo. But the one email that made her hand freeze over the trackpad came from an address with a single name, Eleanor. Subject line, "You got it exactly right." Maya opened it with trembling fingers. "Maya, I read your piece. I don't usually engage with public stories about me, but you told it truthfully, gently. You didn't make me a symbol. You made me a person. Thank you. I hope our flight reminded you, as it reminded me, that the most powerful moments often come when no one is watching." Warmly, Eleanor Grace Maya leaned back in her chair, eyes stinging with emotion. She read it again and again. Then she whispered to herself, "She saw me too." Meanwhile, in a boardroom across the city, the executive team of Grace Air gathered for their quarterly leadership meeting. They had read the same article, watched the numbers, tracked the surge in public goodwill. And now, they were watching a clip from one of their gate cameras. Grainy footage showing an elderly woman helping a struggling mother carry a stroller into the cabin, while Rachel, the flight attendant, gently offered to hold the baby. "She's different," someone whispered. "Look at her now." The head of people and culture turned to the room. "I think we've spent years perfecting our brand," she said. But Eleanor just reminded the world that we should have been perfecting our values. There was a pause. Then the CEO, a tall, quiet man who'd inherited the company after Eleanor retired, spoke up for the first time. "Let's stop calling this an initiative," he said. "This isn't PR. This is a return." "To what?" someone asked. The CEO glanced at the photo Maya had posted online. Eleanor and Maya, smiling side by side. "To who we were, before we got too big to remember why we started." That afternoon, Rachel stepped into a small training room for a session she wasn't scheduled to teach, only attend. But to her surprise, her name was on the printed material. Lesson from 17A, a real story of empathy at altitude. She sat in the back, unnoticed. A young trainer, a fresh-faced hire, walked the room through the scenario, Most attendants listened with polite attention. Some seemed distracted. Then the trainer paused. "I want to read a section of the letter written by the flight attendant involved." Rachel froze. Empathy isn't a script we memorize. It's a muscle we train through experience, through humility, and through choosing again when we fail the first time. The room was quiet. No one knew the letter was hers. No one except Rachel. But for the first time, she didn't need recognition. Her lesson had taken flight, far beyond one aisle, one row, one passenger. Across the bay, Eleanor sat in a garden cafe with her granddaughter. The young woman was scrolling on her phone, pausing to show her articles and comments about the flight that changed everything. "You know you're trending again, right?" she teased. Eleanor sipped her tea. "I'm too old to trend." "You're too humble to admit you love it." Eleanor smiled. "What I love is what came from it." Her granddaughter leaned in. "Do you regret letting people know who you were?" Eleanor paused. "No, I think it was time for someone to remember who I am and for me to remember who I was." A beat passed. Then the younger woman asked, "Do you think you'll ever go back?" Eleanor looked toward the sky, a plane cutting through the blue above. "Maybe," she said, "but only if I sit in coach, window seat, row 17. And far away, in a modest apartment in another city, a woman stared at her phone with a missed call notification from Eleanor Grace. She hadn't picked up, not yet, but her thumb hovered over the screen now, and then she tapped callback. The phone rang once, then twice. Then, "Hi," Eleanor answered softly. There was a pause on the other end, then a shaky breath. "Hi, Mom." The voice on the other end was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. "Hi, Mom." Eleanor sat still, phone pressed gently to her ear, as if one wrong move would shatter the moment. It had been years since she'd heard her daughter's voice, longer still since they'd spoken without walls between them. She closed her eyes. "I'm so glad you called." A pause. "I wasn't going to," her daughter replied, "but then I saw that story about you, the flight, the article, and I realized people still need to hear your voice, and maybe, so do I." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I've missed you. I know, I've missed you too, but we both had sharp edges back then. Neither of us knew how to soften." "I do now," Eleanor said gently, "or at least, I'm learning." There was a quiet, mutual recognition, growth on both sides. "I read the blog," her daughter said. "That girl Maya, she saw you. She wrote about you in a way I haven't seen in years, and it reminded me of the woman who used to tuck me in after long flights, the one who told me airplanes could carry dreams if you packed them just right." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "I forgot I used to say that." "You didn't forget. You just buried it." A long silence passed between them, not awkward but filled with memory. Then her daughter asked, "Can I see you?" Eleanor's hand tightened around the phone. "Whenever you're ready." "I'm ready." Across the city, Maya sat at her laptop, sorting through interview requests and podcast invites. Her story had hit something raw, something real. She'd been offered more visibility in 2 weeks than in the past 2 years combined. But none of that compared to what happened that morning. An envelope had arrived, hand-delivered. Inside, a letter written in elegant cursive on cream stationery. "Dear Maya, I've had journalists write about me, historians quote me, even CEOs tell my story at conferences. But no one ever wrote me the way you did, with care, with stillness, with truth. You didn't tell the world who I was. You reminded me who I still am. Thank you. Keep listening. Warmly, Eleanor Grace." Maya pressed the letter to her chest and whispered, "Thank you for sitting beside me." Back at Grace Air headquarters, the ripple effect of Flight 5Z307 was still expanding. A new training module was under development, focused not just on customer service, but on emotional intelligence. For the first time, crew members would be trained not just on protocol, but on presence. The curriculum featured anonymized moments from Eleanor's flight. One trainer added, "What happened at row 17 wasn't a failure. It was a mirror, and we're choosing to look into it, not look away." Meanwhile, Rachel stood outside the conference room where the first pilot session of the empathy module was about to begin. She had been invited to observe, not as the person who inspired it, but as someone who lived through it. She stepped in, heart steady. As the trainer began the presentation, Rachel quietly took a seat in the back. The screen showed a blurry image of a plane window. A title read, "The View from 17A." Rachel smiled. "It's not about who I was in that moment," she thought. It's about who I became after it. That evening, Eleanor stood in her kitchen, a kettle hissing behind her. The knock at the door was soft but unmistakable. She opened it to find her daughter, older now, wiser too, but still holding the same spark behind her eyes. No words were needed at first. They simply embraced. The kind of embrace that says, "We've been apart too long, but we're here now." Her daughter finally spoke. "I made tea, for both of us. I brought cookies, the dry kind you like." They laughed, then sat down, side by side at a small wooden table. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just two people finding their way back across years, across silence, across pain. The tea steamed between them. Eleanor reached for her cup. "I had a lot of time to think on that flight," she said softly, "about what kind of legacy I want to leave." Her daughter looked up. "And what did you decide?" Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "That legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you return to." 2 months had passed since that quiet flight, and yet, for those who had been touched by it, directly or indirectly, it remained more than a memory. It had become a turning point. At Grace Air headquarters, a ceremony was being held, not flashy, not televised, but meaningful. A modest private gathering in the main atrium, where employees from every department had come together to witness something rare, the unveiling of a new plaque. At the center of the polished wall was a name etched in brass, the Eleanor Grace Leadership Scholarship, for those who lead with heart. Rachel stood in the back, wearing her uniform, heart full. She had been invited as a guest of honor, though no one said her name aloud. But when the CEO took the mic and said, "This fund exists because of a quiet reminder from 35,000 feet, that leadership isn't always loud. Sometimes it's seated by the window, asking for warm water," her eyes welled. Eleanor was not in the building. She had declined to attend, citing a family engagement. But her spirit was everywhere, in the smiles, in the stories, in the shift you could feel in the room. That same day, Maya found herself stepping onto another plane, this time headed east, toward a speaking event she'd been invited to. Not because she was a famous writer, but because she'd listened and written when it mattered. As she settled into her seat, ironically, 17A, she smiled. She pulled out a notebook and began writing, not about Eleanor this time, but about the quiet woman across the aisle nervously clutching her purse, about the exhausted mother juggling a toddler and a tray of snacks, about the teenage boy who gave up his seat for an elderly man without being asked. She had learned to see people, really see them, and that had changed everything. Across town, Eleanor Grace was sitting on the porch of her daughter's home, sipping tea with a blanket over her knees. Her daughter brought out a tray of cookies, the dry kind, and they laughed, like they always used to. "We never did that Italy trip," her daughter said. "We still can," Eleanor smiled. "Maybe not with backpacks and hostels, but I think we'd make excellent train travelers." A pause. Then, "Thank you for calling me." Her daughter looked away, then back. "Thank you for picking up." Eleanor reached over and squeezed her hand. "No one builds an airline to escape people. You build one to find your way back." That weekend, Maya's blog post was reshared by a nonprofit working in aviation education. The caption read, "The woman in 17A changed one flight. The girl beside her changed how we tell the story." In the comments, strangers shared stories of kindness from their own flights. Flight attendants who waited patiently, passengers who comforted crying babies, pilots who took time to greet a nervous child. Underneath one of those comments, Rachel quietly typed, "I wasn't proud of how I acted, but I'm proud of who I became because of it. Grace is something we grow into." 1 week later, a new trainee joined Grace Air's customer experience team. On her first day, she was handed a packet. Inside, crew expectations, safety protocols, and a folded printout titled "The View from 17A." It didn't name Eleanor. It didn't name Rachel. It just told a story. A story about seeing people. A story about one moment of discomfort that opened the door to healing. A story that would now be part of the company's foundation, not as a cautionary tale, but as a compass. And somewhere, quietly, Eleanor Grace boarded a flight. She wore no name tag. No announcement was made. She sat in seat 17A, as always. A young man sitting beside her glanced over and said, "First time flying," she chuckled. "Not quite," he smiled. "Me neither. Still a little nervous, though." She nodded. "It helps to look out the window." They sat in silence for a moment. Then she turned and added, "Sometimes it helps to talk." He smiled. "I'm Liam. I'm Eleanor." The plane began to roll down the runway. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's the kindness you pass forward, row by row, seat by seat, story by story. And Eleanor Grace, she was still flying, still watching, still listening. Seat 17A was never just a seat. It was where people learned to look again.